From noble blood to moral crisis. Claus Philipp Maria Schenk Graf von Stauffenberg was born in 1907 to a family steeped in Swabian aristocracy and Prussian tradition. From youth, he was a paragon of discipline and intellect, excelling in music, poetry, and military studies at Bamberg and Berlin. His rise through the ranks of the Reichswehr during the 1930s brought him into the circle of reform-minded officers who questioned not just tactics, but the soul of German warfare. By 1942, the brutal realities of the Eastern Front, the mass shootings, scorched villages, and genocidal sweeps of Einsatzgruppen unleashed a moral crisis that Stauffenberg could not suppress. The ideals of duty and honor conflicted violently with the savagery he witnessed. "We are betraying everything that is German and honorable," he confided to fellow officers. The circle of resistance widened. Ludwig Beck, Henning von Treschow, and Friedrich Albrecht, men willing to risk all for conscience and country. Then fate intervened. On April 7, 1943, near Sidi Bouzid, Tunisia, Stauffenberg's staff car was strafed by Allied fighters. Crimson fire and twisted metal left him gravely wounded, losing his right hand, 2 fingers on his left, and his left eye. While many saw tragedy, Stauffenberg found clarity. "It must be done," he told his wife, Nina, in a hospital room. "We must kill Hitler." Suspense coiled around him, his wounds and resolve fused into a mission that would soon grip the very heart of the Reich. Subscribe so you won't miss new stories, and feel free to ask questions in the comments. Your interest inspires us to discover new topics. He joined the ranks of the German General Staff in Berlin, the nerve center of power, bureaucracy, and intrigue. Here, whispers of resistance became concrete plans as the disaster of Stalingrad and the relentless Allied bombing made the need more urgent. Operation Valkyrie was the linchpin, a plan originally designed to mobilize the reserve army in the event of civil unrest, now re-engineered as a coup against the Nazi regime itself. Plotting under shadows, the conspirators unite. Spring 1944 brought open terror and paranoia. The Gestapo stalked halls, the SS monitored telephones, and every shadow cast suspicion. Stauffenberg, promoted to Chief of Staff for the Reserve Army, wielded access to the highest corridors of power, meeting with Hitler, Keitel, and Himmler at close quarters. Yet, each handshake was a test, each document a potential death sentence. The core conspirators convened at Albrecht's office on Bendlerstrasse in Berlin. Maps and blueprints of the Wolfschanz, Wolf's Lair, Hitler's fortified headquarters in Rassenburg, East Prussia, were studied as potential blast sites. The plot's architecture crystallized. Stauffenberg would carry a British-made plastic explosive in a brown briefcase, place it near Hitler during a military conference, then escape to Berlin to trigger Valkyrie. The coup would seize radio stations, arrest Nazi officials, and announce a new government. Suspense thickened as Stauffenberg's injuries complicated the plan. His missing hand required him to painstakingly set explosives with only 3 fingers. Each practice session was a race against anxiety, timers whirring, heart pounding, hands trembling. Meanwhile, the war's tide turned ominously. On June 6, 1944, Allied troops landed in Normandy. The Eastern Front crumbled under the Soviet summer offensive. German cities became ruins, and hope flickered in the dark, turning internal resistance into a desperate gamble. Every day, the conspirators wondered if the end would come from outside, or if they could spark it from within. The plotters' circle grew to include generals like Ludwig Beck and communications masterminds like Karl Heinrich von Stauffenberg in France, whose role would be to arrest SS officers in Paris. Each man carried a secret, every document coded in language that, if discovered, meant torture and execution. They waited, in tension and terror, for the right moment. The next conference at the Wolf's Lair could be the last. The day of reckoning, July 20, 1944. Dawn crept over East Prussia on July 20, 1944, as Stauffenberg, his adjutant Werner von Haeften, and a brown briefcase packed with explosives boarded a Luftwaffe plane for Rassenburg. Their journey was cloaked in bureaucratic pretense, a routine briefing, a staff update. In truth, the conspirators had gambled all on this day. If they failed, execution awaited not only themselves, but their families. The Wolf's Lair soon loomed through the pine forests, its concrete bunkers crawling with SS guards. Hitler's conference, typically held in a windowless map room, was unexpectedly relocated to a wooden hut due to the summer heat. Stauffenberg, sweating and haunted, entered at precisely 12:30 p.m. The room, 24 officers, maps of the crumbling Eastern Front stretched across the table, Hitler standing near the center. Stauffenberg excused himself mid-briefing, claiming an urgent phone call. In a quiet side room, he fumbled with the bomb's fuse, his three-fingered hand struggling against time. Only one of the two plastic explosive charges could be set. The briefcase was armed as the minutes ticked toward fate. He returned, placing the brown case under the map table, almost directly beside Hitler. At 12:42 p.m., Stauffenberg again excused himself. Quietly, he walked past the guards, left the building, and awaited the explosion with leaden breath. A thunderous detonation shattered windows, a roar that rent the silence of the Wolf's Lair. Flames licked the walls, dust and screams filled the air. 4 officers were mortally wounded. Hitler's right arm was badly injured. But, through a cruel twist of fate, the heavy oak table deflected much of the blast, and Adolf Hitler survived. Stauffenberg, convinced the Führer was dead, dashed to his car and raced for the airfield. Berlin awaited, along with destiny itself. The coup in Berlin, Operation Valkyrie unleashed. Berlin was a crucible of uncertainty and adrenaline, as Stauffenberg landed at Rangsdorf airfield and sped toward Bendlerblock. There, Albrecht unfolded the secret orders. Operation Valkyrie was activated. Troops of the Reserve Army began mobilizing, radio stations seized, outlets broadcasting the death of the Führer. Arrests of key Nazi officials commenced. Heinrich Himmler and Joseph Goebbels, prime targets, evaded initial confinement. Suspense redoubled. The plotters risked every minute against Nazi countermeasures. General Fromm, commander of the Reserve Army, wavered between collaboration and betrayal, uncertain of Hitler's fate. Calls from Rassenberg, crackling with confusion, revealed Hitler had miraculously survived the blast. The coup teetered on the edge of collapse. Stauffenberg, refusing to abandon hope, rallied the conspirators. The Führer is dead. Valkyrie must proceed. But the truth seeped in. The SS rapidly regained control. Troops questioned orders, loyalty flickered under the pressure of conflicting reports. By midnight, Bendlerblock bristled with uncertainty and terror. The Gestapo closed in, the phone lines rang with threats, and the last fragments of resistance clung to the hope that Hitler's injuries might still prove fatal. It was clear, the coup had failed. Sacrifice and retribution, the plot unravels. The final hours in Berlin were charged with dread. General Fromm, seeking to save himself, ordered the arrest of Stauffenberg, Albrecht, Haeften, and other leaders. Bendlerblock echoed with gunfire. The conspirators offered no resistance, understanding the consequence of betrayal and failure. Just after midnight, July 21, 1944, Stauffenberg, Albrecht, and Haeften were brought to the courtyard. Refusing blindfolds, von Stauffenberg's last words rang clear: "Long live our sacred Germany." Shots cracked in the darkness, ending their lives. The aftermath was merciless. The Nazi regime dispatched the SS and Gestapo to eliminate all traces of resistance. Thousands were arrested. Torture chambers wrung out confessions. Ludwig Beck chose suicide over execution. Stulpnagel tried to take his own life in Paris, partially succeeded, but was later hanged. Families, friends, and even children of the plotters bore the brunt of Nazi vengeance. Yet, in failure, a message was born. The July 20th plot remains the most daring, nearly successful attempt to bring down Adolf Hitler from within his own ranks, a testament to conscience, courage, and the burning hope that even in darkness, resistance endures. Shockwaves across the Reich. As word of the failed assassination and coup attempt rocketed through Nazi Germany, Hitler moved with the ferocity of a wounded predator. By dawn on July 21, 1944, his survival was announced by radio and loudspeakers in every city: "The Führer lives." Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels orchestrated an immediate campaign, broadcasting Hitler's near-miraculous escape and his resolve to avenge this cowardly act of treason. Hitler summoned the entire military and governmental leadership to the Wolf's Lair. His wounded right arm, bandaged and trembling, was displayed for all to see, a living symbol of his invincibility and an implicit warning against further conspiracy. The Reich's machinery pivoted: executions, interrogations, arrest lists. Under the furious gaze of the Gestapo and SS, suspects were hunted with fanatical rigor. Every department of the military, every bureaucratic nook was scrutinized for ties to the plot. Officers who once enjoyed the camaraderie of Bendlerblock now cowered in cellars or burned incriminating notes, fearing the knock on the door. The resistance network, so painstakingly knit over months, unraveled as the reach of Nazi vengeance extended through Berlin, Paris, Vienna, and beyond. Yet, amid the terror, flickers of silent admiration surfaced among the Wehrmacht. They tried, whispered some, when no one else dared. Stauffenberg's deed, though doomed, shattered the myth of Hitler's absolute control over his generals. The Wolf's Lair itself was reshaped, furniture rearranged, security protocols intensified, as paranoia and suspicion infected daily operations. Abroad, the Allies drew hope from the news. Churchill addressed the British Parliament: "Not all Germans are Nazis. There are brave men among them." The resistance, though crushed, had sent shockwaves through the Reich and the world. Webs of betrayal and torture. As July waned, Heinrich Himmler and the Gestapo unleashed Operation Action Gitter, a systematic hunt for those involved and suspected. Arrests transcended the direct conspirators. Anyone marginally connected, even by friendship or distant rumor, fell under suspicion. Gestapo headquarters, especially the infamous house prison on Prinz Albrechtstrasse in Berlin, became scenes of unmitigated horror. Torture was routine. Erich Feldjebel, the communications chief who helped disrupt Nazi signals during the coup, endured brutal interrogations before his execution in September 1944. Karl Heinrich von Stauffenberg, who attempted to incite a Paris coup, survived a suicide attempt but was ultimately hanged at Plötzensee prison after a sham trial. The People's Court, dominated by the sadistic judge Roland Freisler, staged public spectacles of humiliation and death. Trials were little more than propaganda, designed to terrify the population. Defendants were berated, degraded, robbed of dignity. Videos made the rounds, to be shown in army barracks and factories, of generals in handcuffs, condemned by Hitler's word alone. The Nazi regime did not pause with death sentences. Whole families bore punishment, children were evicted from schools, spouses ostracized, estates confiscated. The term Sippenhaft, kin liability, became a weapon. Nina von Stauffenberg, Claus's widow, was arrested and interned with her children in a concentration camp, though they survived the war. Throughout the Reich, whispers of the Valkyrie plot continued to circulate in secret, a reminder that even the tightest grip could be challenged, even if the penalty was paid in blood. The ripples abroad, allies and armies react. The reverberations of the July 20th plot touched far beyond Germany. Churchill, Roosevelt, and de Gaulle studied the implications for Allied strategy. Intelligence agencies pieced together details of the German resistance, seeking clues for future collaboration with anti-Nazi elements. They realized that despite years of totalitarian control, organized dissent remained alive in Hitler's heartland. In occupied Europe, news of the coup galvanized resistance movements. Polish Home Army fighters in Warsaw, French Maquis in the countryside, Yugoslav partisans, all took heart. If Hitler could be so nearly killed by insiders, perhaps external efforts would not be in vain. Messages passed clandestinely through coded transmissions, inspiring rallies of courage against the fading, yet still deadly, Axis occupation. Yet, for the German military, repercussions were severe. Hitler used the failed coup as an excuse to purge the Wehrmacht. Trusted officers were replaced by zealous Nazi loyalists. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, suspected of tacit support for the conspirators, was forced to commit suicide in October 1944, his death disguised as a heroic passing to maintain morale on the Western Front. The coup's echoes reached the Soviet command. Joseph Stalin's advisors noted the instability, yet pressed the assault on the Eastern Front with unwavering brutality. Soviet lines crashed through Polish and Ukrainian territories, sensing German vulnerability amplified by internal chaos. In Italy, after Rome fell on June 4, 1944, and the push toward Florence began, rumors of the plot destabilized German units. Desertions increased. The SS responded with intestine fear, terrorizing not only Allied prisoners of war but also their own ranks. Aftermath in the Wolf's Lair and Berlin. Hitler's subsequent paranoia transformed the Wolf's Lair and the central apparatus of power. Reinforced concrete, elaborate security, ground-to-air defenses, the Führer fortified his sanctuaries. He now met only in the company of bodyguards, all doors watched, all food tasted. For the rest of the war, he was haunted by the knowledge that death could come from within. In Berlin, surviving resistance members were driven underground. Some, like Helmuth James von Moltke and the Kreisau Circle, worked quietly, preparing blueprint visions for a post-Nazi Germany, even as their numbers dwindled under constant threat of detection. The shadow cast by the Valkyrie plot never lifted. The Nazi hierarchy tightened its grip, silencing all dissent. Yet pockets of resistance lingered, sabotage and subterfuge continuing. Some officers, shamed by Hitler's survival, still absconded intelligence to the Allies or slowed operations in protest. Stauffenberg's legacy grew among those desperate for a different future. Photographs circulated secretly of his noble features, the black patch over his eye, the determined set of his jaw, a symbol that not every German wore the face of the Nazi machine. Legacy etched in memory and history. After the war's end in May 1945, the true tale of Operation Valkyrie rippled through the world, finally freed from censorship and fear. Allied investigators, piecing together captured documents and survivor testimonies, began to understand the full scope of Germany's internal resistance, a story of conscience and peril amid overwhelming darkness. In post-war Germany, the memorialization of Claus von Stauffenberg and his fellow conspirators became a matter of national reflection. Once branded traitors, they came to be regarded as moral heroes, their faces engraved on statues, plaques, and books across the land. The courtyard at Bendlerblock, where Stauffenberg fell, now holds the German Resistance Memorial Center, a place of pilgrimage and education. Their story became integral to the cultural fabric of the new German Republic. Each July 20th, candles flicker and prayers are spoken, not only for Stauffenberg, but for the thousands who believed that duty could mean defiance against evil. Globally, the Valkyrie plot stands as testament: tyranny can provoke conscience, courage can spring from the heart of darkness. The chance missed on July 20th, 1944, lingers as an open question: how different might history have been had fate delivered a few crucial inches in that wooden conference room? Survivors' ordeals and posthumous vindication. In the months following the failed coup, the surviving families and associates of the Valkyrie conspirators endured unspeakable hardship. Sippenhaft, the Nazi principle of kin liability, meant that the wives, children, siblings, and even distant relatives of accused plotters faced arrest, interrogation, and exile. Nina von Stauffenberg, heavily pregnant, was secretly interned with her children under new, strict regulations. She gave birth to her youngest daughter, Constance, behind barbed wire in a Sippenhaft camp, a fate shared by dozens of other families from the resistance circles. Children were frequently separated from their mothers, with their true identities concealed to erase the trace of their traitorous bloodline. Some were eventually found and reunited only after the war's chaos had subsided. For the conspirators who survived initial arrest, the agony persisted. The People's Court continued its orchestrated executions well into the late autumn of 1944. White-hot spotlights glared as Judge Roland Freisler shouted ridicule, stripping away the dignity of the accused before sentencing them to death. Helmuth James von Moltke, organizer of the Kreisau Circle, endured months of interrogation before his execution in January 1945. Many dissidents, broken physically but not spiritually, faced death with a stoic resolve that would echo for generations. The immediate post-war era was filled with a difficult reckoning. For a time, the legacy of the July 20th plotters remained overshadowed by the need to denazify society and rebuild shattered cities. Yet as Germany reconstructed, public trials and documentation of Nazi crimes brought the story of resistance into the light. By the late 1940s and early 1950s, new narratives of heroism began to form, aided by survivor testimonies and Allied investigations. Stauffenberg's name, once synonymous with treachery to a lost cause, was gradually recast as a moral beacon in a landscape defined by darkness. Remaking the German memory. With the division of Germany into East and West, the story of the Valkyrie plot suffered further distortions, and then eventual redemption. In East Germany, the communist regime minimized and sometimes denigrated the July 20th conspirators, portraying them as aristocrats detached from the people's cause. In West Germany, as democracy took fragile root, politicians, historians, and artists began to recast Stauffenberg and his circle as pioneering figures for the rebirth of German decency and a constitutional state. A pivotal moment came in 1954, on the 10th anniversary of the plot, when President Theodor Heuss paid tribute at the Bendlerblock Memorial in Berlin. The ceremony united military veterans and former resistors, and for the first time, millions heard the story told not as a mere footnote of failure, but as an act of conscience that truly belonged to the nation. Textbooks were rewritten. Schoolchildren learned of the men and women who dared to dream beyond Hitler's tyranny. German officers in the new Bundeswehr were taught to reflect on the example of Innere Führung, leadership with a conscience, modeled after men like Stauffenberg. In films, novels, and public memory, the July 20th movement became a crucial part of grappling with the nation's past. Society's slow embrace of these figures was neither smooth nor free of controversy. In a country where war guilt and personal memory often clashed, some questioned whether the plotters had acted from principle or out of desperation to save themselves or the old order. Yet over decades, a consensus emerged: the men and women of July 20th had been among the few Germans who openly dared challenge evil. Valkyrie echoes in the modern world. As Cold War tensions gripped the divided Germanys and the wider globe, the story of the July 20th plot gained new significance. For dissidents in Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia, it held lessons on the peril and power of internal resistance in totalitarian regimes. Leaflets quoting Stauffenberg's appeals sometimes circulated in secret, fueling whispers that moral action was possible, even under the eye of the state. Internationally, the example of the Valkyrie plot became required reading in military academies and diplomatic circles. Historians parsed its failures and successes, the vital role of communication, the near paralysis of the German military chain of command in the critical hours, the moral courage required to risk all against overwhelming odds. The narrative-inspired literature and film, from haunting German dramas to Hollywood adaptations, all exploring the same agonizing dilemma: when does duty to country demand treason against its leaders? Human rights activists and philosophers, too, invoked the names of Stauffenberg, Beck, and Albrecht to argue for the supremacy of conscience over blind obedience. In the post-war Nuremberg trials, Nazi defendants had tried to hide behind the excuse of following orders. The memory of July 20th was a powerful rejoinder that the truly honorable had chosen a different path. The dilemma of duty and disobedience. The July 20th plot is remembered not just for its dramatic moments, the smoky blast at the Wolf's Lair, the frantic hours in Berlin, but for the enduring question it poses: when is disobedience a moral imperative? Stauffenberg's letters to his wife, preserved in archives, offer poignant glimpses into his mindset. "It is time that someone did something," he wrote. "If we do not act, all shall be lost, and our souls as well." His conscience, once rooted in the traditions of the officer corps, had evolved into a force for radical change, an unwillingness to be complicit in state crimes, no matter the personal cost. This legacy resonates deeply with modern Germany's emphasis on civil courage, Zivilcourage. The story is part of citizenship education, shaping the political engagement of generations who ask how to balance patriotism with the universal obligation to resist injustice. Nowhere is this more visible than every July 20th at the Bendlerblock, where dignitaries, soldiers, and students gather for a solemn ceremony. Wreaths are laid on the courtyard cobbles, where only ghosts now linger, as a reminder that silence and compliance can be as dangerous as open evil. From tragedy to lesson, global influence. As the decades have passed, the failed coup of July 20th, 1944, and the saga of Claus von Stauffenberg have transcended the boundaries of Germany. In Israel, discussions about resistance within the Holocaust incorporate the German plotter's story, often in dialogues about the limits and risks of moral resistance. In the United States, the tale is studied in military academies as an exemplar of the tension between command and conscience. The Valkyrie plots would have inspired countless works of alternate history, imagining a world where Hitler's death ushered in peace, spared millions, and reshaped global politics. For all its echoes, the true power of the story is not in speculation, but in inspiration. The names of Stauffenberg, Beck, Albrecht, and their compatriots are recited in speeches on human rights and the importance of ethical leadership. As individuals and societies wrestle with abuses of power, from post-war dictatorships to ongoing struggles for democracy, the failed but valiant coup of July 20th reminds us that history sometimes turns on the courage and the conscience of a few. Bendlerblock and the Pilgrimage for Remembrance. Every year, on July 20th, the Bendlerblock courtyard in Berlin, where Claus von Stauffenberg and his co-conspirators were executed, becomes a sacred space. The air hums with remembrance as politicians, military officers, descendants of resistance fighters, and ordinary citizens gather to lay wreaths and reflect on the enduring legacy of conscience. The site, now home to the German Resistance Memorial Center, offers visitors not only solemn silence but also voices from the past, journals, photographs, handwritten plans for Valkyrie, and portraits of those who fell. Educational programs bring schoolchildren to study the perilous legacy of disobedience as virtue, not vice. The courtyard's memorial stone bears an immortal line, "You did not bear the shame. You resisted." This phrase, etched into granite, has become a lodestar for modern Germany's reckoning with its complicated history. Those in uniform, officers from the Bundeswehr, parade past the memorial in ceremonies honoring Stauffenberg not as traitor, but as the very model of civil courage. Every new generation of German soldiers receives instruction on the July 20th plot, shaping a military ethos centered less on blind obedience and more on critical, ethical judgment. Stauffenberg in film, art, and literature. The legend of Claus von Stauffenberg has crossed borders, evolving through countless adaptations in film, art, and literature. In 2004, Germany released the film Stauffenberg, starring Sebastian Koch, evoking the colonel's steely resolve and personal turmoil. In Hollywood, the 2008 blockbuster Valkyrie, with Tom Cruise in the lead, presents the tension-filled hours in vivid drama to a worldwide audience. Writers and artists have conjured their own renditions, some reverent, others critical, debating whether the plotters acted from ethical conviction or political pragmatism. Novels and graphic memoirs depict Stauffenberg's transformation, while paintings and sculptures at memorial sites portray him with iconic features: his missing hand, his strict gaze, his bandaged eye. For survivors and families, these cultural works preserve not only historical fact but emotional truth. Nina von Stauffenberg, who lived until 2006, granted interviews, correcting misconceptions and fighting to keep her husband's legacy pure. The arts ensure the Valkyrie plot remains a living story, not merely a statistic or footnote. It is revisited at moments of political crisis or anniversaries of tyranny, part of the ongoing struggle to measure moral action against expedience. The military ethos, lessons in conscience. In post-war Germany, the Bundeswehr redefined its doctrine, rooting its code of officers' conduct in the lessons of July 20th, 1944. Innere Führung, the idea that military authority must bow to democratic values and personal conscience, came to underpin the officer's oath. Courses in leadership and ethics make July 20th central. The example of Stauffenberg and his circle sets expectations that anyone in authority must question unjust orders, even at personal risk. The story echoes in classrooms not only in Germany but across NATO and allied militaries. The line between duty and morality is not always clear, and each officer must have the courage to make that choice. Anecdotes abound, from reunions of resistance families to Bundeswehr ceremonies. Stauffenberg's name is invoked to rally ethical reflection amid new challenges. When German troops are deployed abroad, the legacy of the July 20th plot is invoked in briefings, reminding soldiers that conscience and courage are international duties. Global civil courage, the Valkyrie lesson abroad. Valkyrie's example impacts not only Germany but a world confronting authoritarianism, even today. Civil courage, talking back to power, is a theme in textbooks from South Africa to South Korea, wherever children are taught about standing up for what's right. In Poland, Hungary, and elsewhere, Stauffenberg and his co-conspirators have inspired dissidents resisting oppressive states. Their photographs, their stories, are stamped on pamphlets and murals, sometimes risking censorship or worse. In the Western canon, the July 20th plot remains a recurring motif in discussions of just war theory. Philosophers, theologians, and policymakers reference the failed coup as a case study. What is the cost of doing right when the price is unbearable? The story provokes debates about the mechanisms of tyranny, the capacity for ordinary people to do extraordinary things, and the grace to admit national mistakes. Every time a new regime is toppled by the courage of its citizens, whispers of Valkyrie echo in the background. Final reflections, the enduring power of July 20th. Now, almost 80 years after the fateful attempt in the Wolf's Lair, Valkyrie remains more than history. It is a call for personal courage in the face of institutional evil. Stauffenberg's patch and briefcase, his final rallying cry, "Long live our sacred Germany," seem at once tragic and triumphant. His legacy transcends time and place, encouraging generations to weigh obedience against justice. The July 20th plot is not simply a tale of failure, it's a reminder that even in a world of terror, conscience can still rise, however briefly, to challenge tyranny. Each anniversary, bells ring in German towns, children recite the names of those who fell, and dignitaries remind their nations, the heroes of Valkyrie tried. And because they tried, history did not belong solely to the criminals, but also to those who, in the deepest night, still kept alight the fragile, stubborn flame of resistance. Whether in Berlin's memorial stones, the lessons of military academies, or the whispers among people opposing injustice around the world, Claus von Stauffenberg and his comrades continue to inspire. Proof that integrity, even when it ends on a cold stone courtyard, is never wholly extinguished.